diner was always a noisy place at lunchtime. Forks clattering, coffee pouring, voices overlapping. But sometimes the noise wasn't from the plates. Sometimes it was the customers. That day, a group of businessmen in crisp suits sat at a corner booth, their laughter cutting through the air. The waitress serving them, a young black woman with kind eyes, carried herself quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to disappear. The reason was plain to see. A scar ran jagged across her neck, another down her forearm, marks she never tried to hide but couldn't conceal either. One of the men smirked as she poured coffee into his cup. "Careful there, sweetheart," he sneered, nudging his friend. "Wouldn't want you to spill hot coffee and add another scar to your collection." The table erupted in cruel laughter. Her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't answer. She simply straightened, pressed her lips together, and walked back toward the counter. The men kept laughing, their cruelty bouncing off the walls like poison. Not everyone laughed. At a booth near the window, an older man in a faded cap set down his fork. His hands were weathered, his back straight despite the years, and his eyes sharp and knowing, followed the waitress as she walked away. The cap bore the insignia of a military unit, worn with pride but never for show. Something about the scars on her arm had made him stop mid-bite, his chest tightening with a memory he thought he'd buried long ago. The men continued their mockery, making jokes about knife fights and bad boyfriends, their laughter spilling across the diner. The waitress ignored them, moving with quiet dignity as she refilled waters, wiped tables, and carried plates heavier than they looked. But when she reached up to adjust a tray, her sleeve slid back, and the old man's eyes widened. There, etched into her skin just below the scars, was a tattoo, small, faded, but unmistakable. A unit number. His unit number. He froze, his heart thudding against his ribs. That tattoo wasn't something a civilian would ever carry. It was earned in sand, sweat, and blood. And suddenly the scars made sense. Not as marks of shame, but as medals of survival. He set down his fork, rose from his seat, and walked slowly toward her. The businessmen barely noticed, too busy reveling in their own cruelty, but the air in the diner shifted. People nearby sensed something was about to happen. The waitress glanced up as the old man approached. For a moment, fear flickered in her eyes, fear that he too was about to say something cruel, but instead he stopped just a few feet away, his voice low but steady. "Excuse me, miss," he said, pointing gently at her arm. "That tattoo, where did you get it?" Her eyes widened, and she instinctively tugged her sleeve down. For a long moment she said nothing, her throat working, as if she wasn't sure whether to answer. Finally, her voice came out soft but firm. "Fallujah," she whispered. The diner seemed to go silent, every clink of silverware fading. The old man's breath caught. Fallujah. He had been there too. The battles, the dust, the losses. They all flooded back. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I thought so," he murmured. Then, in a voice that carried across the diner, he added, "Gentlemen, you're laughing at a combat medic. Those scars? She earned them saving lives." The laughter died instantly. The businessmen froze, faces paling as the words sank in. The entire diner turned to look at the waitress, who stood stiff, her eyes darting nervously as if she wanted to disappear. The old man didn't let the silence drag. He straightened his cap and saluted her, crisp and proud, as though she were still wearing the uniform. Gasps rippled through the room. Some patrons clapped softly. Others whispered to each other, realization dawning. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, forcing a small, tight smile. For years, those scars had been the source of shame, the reason people whispered and mocked. Now, in a single moment, they had been reframed, not as a disfigurement, but as proof of courage. She whispered, "Thank you, sir," her voice trembling, and he replied firmly, "No, thank you." His words carried weight, silencing every cruel tongue in the room. The businessmen shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of the glares burning into them from every corner of the diner. One of them tried to mumble an excuse, but the old man cut him off with a look sharp enough to pierce steel. "You don't mock the scars of someone who fought for this country," he said. "You don't mock survival." The room erupted in quiet applause, the kind that grows from respect, not performance. The waitress wiped at her eyes, and for the first time in years, she stood a little taller. After the applause died down, the waitress excused herself and slipped into the kitchen, her chest heaving as she pressed her hands against the counter. Memories she had buried clawed their way to the surface. The deafening roar of explosions, the sandstorms that blinded them, the cries of the wounded as she knelt in the dirt, bandaging, stitching, saving lives she knew she might never see again. She had never spoken about it, not to strangers, not even to her family. To the world outside, she was just a waitress with scars, but now someone knew. The veteran, whose name was Henry, waited patiently. When she returned, carrying a pot of coffee with trembling hands, he smiled gently and gestured for her to sit at his booth. She hesitated, uncertain, but something in his steady gaze reassured her. She slid onto the bench across from him, her eyes still cautious. He leaned forward and spoke softly, just for her. "You were there during the second battle, weren't you? I can see it in your eyes. We lost good men there, but we also had angels. Angels in uniform who patched us up and carried us through. Were you one of them?" Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I was a medic," she whispered. 19 years old. I thought I was ready. I thought I could handle the blood, the pain. But nothing prepares you for holding someone's hand as they slip away." Her voice cracked, and she lowered her eyes. Henry reached across the table, his hand weathered but steady, resting gently on hers. "You don't need to explain to me," he said quietly. "I remember you medics. I wouldn't be here without one." The businessman at the corner booth tried to slink out unnoticed, but the other patrons weren't about to let them off the hook. One of the older women near the counter stood and blocked their path. "You owe her an apology," she snapped, her voice firm. They stammered, eyes darting to the waitress, who looked away, embarrassed by the attention. But Henry's glare cut through them like steel. "Say it," he commanded. With faces red and voices low, the men mumbled apologies before slinking out, their arrogance deflated like balloons in the sun. For the first time, the waitress felt the tide shift. The shame that had clung to her scars like a shadow began to lift. People didn't just see her as a scarred waitress anymore. They saw her as a soldier, a survivor, someone who had carried burdens they could never imagine. And yet she didn't bask in the attention. Instead, she looked at Henry and whispered, "Why did you speak up for me? You didn't even know me." His answer was simple, but it struck her heart. "Because you were one of us, and no one mocks. Family." Later that evening, as the diner emptied and the chairs were turned upside down on tables, Henry stayed behind to help her mop the floor. Between the swish of the mop and the hum of the old jukebox, she finally opened up. She told him how, after the war, she had struggled to adjust, haunted by nightmares, unable to sit in silence without hearing echoes of the battlefield. She'd taken the job at the diner because it was simple, grounding, and gave her something to do with her hands. But the stares, the whispers, the cruel laughter, it had eaten away at her spirit. Henry listened without interruption, his expression solemn but kind. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You know, scars scare small minds. They don't understand what it takes to survive. But for those of us who've walked through hell, scars are just proof we made it out alive." His words settled in her chest like a balm, easing a pain she had carried alone for too long. For the first time, she realized maybe her scars weren't something to hide. Maybe they were her story. The next day, something unexpected happened. The regular customers who had witnessed the scene began treating her differently. An older man tipped her twice the usual, whispering, "Thank you for your service." A young mother brought her daughter to the counter and said softly, "Tell her what you told me." The little girl looked up shyly and whispered, "You're brave." The waitress blinked back tears, smiling faintly as she patted the girl's hand. Piece by piece, the narrative of her life was changing. Henry became a fixture at the diner. He'd sit by the window every morning, sipping black coffee, and sometimes other veterans would join him. They created a quiet circle of respect, a place where she could share stories without fear of judgment. And slowly, she began to heal. Her back straightened. Her laughter returned. The scars were still there, but they no longer felt like chains. They felt like medals only the strongest could wear. One evening, after the last customer left, she pulled Henry aside. Her eyes shone with determination as she said, "I've been hiding too long. I think it's time I told my story. Not just here, but to anyone who needs to hear it." Henry smiled, pride softening his features. "That's the world deserves to know it." In that moment, she realized the truth. Her scars weren't the end of her story. They were the beginning of a new mission.